The Harbor Freight Sawmill, the entry-level Woodmizer sawmill, two of the most popular choices on the market today. Both cost the same amount of money, both do the same thing, but it'd be hard to find two machines that are built more differently. So if you're in the market for a small, affordable sawmill, you're in the right place. We're going to take a look at both of these mills from top to bottom in up-close detail so you can see the differences between the two and pick which one might be the right sawmill for you. My name's Dave Whipple and you're watching Bush Radical. If you've been kicking around the idea of getting a small, affordable sawmill, I'm sure you're aware that there's a lot of options out there today. But Harbor Freight and Woodmizer probably are the first two brands that come to mind when you're thinking of a mill that doesn't cost a lot and it's easy to get your hands on. Let's start with the Harbor Freight mill, and I'll show you how it works. Now, the saw head on the Harbor Freight mill is operated by this cable and pulley system. It's quite ingenious. Cables anchor to two posts on the top of the saw head, and then they go around the end of a set of pulleys. When you crank the handle of the sawmill head to raise or lower it, it will either push the bar out with the pulleys on the end, or it'll bring it back. And this is how you raise or lower the saw head and adjust how thick of a cut you want. I think it's a pretty good system. It's a little slow because every turn of the handle raises the mill about 1/4 of an inch and lowers it about 1/4 of an inch. But it's also a simple way to gauge your cut. 4 cranks is a 1-inch board. 6 cranks is an 1.5-inch board. And at the end of the cables is this adjustment bolt so you can get the saw blade and the saw head parallel with your track. And once you've adjusted your saw head and you're ready to make your cut, there are 2 locking levers that clamp the saw head to the upright posts. This ensures that there is no way the saw head can vibrate loose and slip and change the thickness of the cut. The Woodmizer mill is also run by a cable system. The cables go through a hole in this central bar and then they connect up at the top of the saw head with this banjo-style clamp at the end of the cable. To set the sawmill blade parallel with the track, you adjust it here at the top with this nut. Now the bar that winds up the cable is attached directly to the handle that raises and lowers the saw head. And this is actually quite a simple system. The saw head is raised and lowered just simply by wrapping the cable up on that central bar. Now the saw head ratchets on the way up and locks in place, but when you lower it, it's lowered by the slip clutch. The friction of the clutch holds the saw head in place not only while you're raising it, but during the cut itself. And there are no handles that lock the saw head in place like there are on the Harbor Freight. Let's take a look at watering, cooling the blade, lubricating the blade. On the Harbor Freight mill, there's a water tank with a hose that runs straight down. It goes into a hardware store style ball valve with a simple on or off thumb adjustment, couple hose clamps, and it runs down to a piece of copper tubing that passes through the post that holds the saw blade guides. Now, I found that this ball valve is quite easy to adjust, and it's just a standard hardware store ball valve, so it would be easy to replace in the event that it just gets old and stops working the way it should. The piece of copper tubing can be adjusted in or out depending on where you want the water to drip on the blade. I mean, this is quite rudimentary for a modern piece of equipment, but it works quite well. Put the drip nozzle where you want it, tighten it down, you're pretty much done. On the Woodmizer mill, the water tank goes to the saw head itself, not to the top of the post. It's held in place by just a standard rubber strap. So being that it moves with the saw head, it has a much shorter hose, and the hose passes through a rubber grommet and drips water on the blade right in front of the guide block. And you adjust the flow of water just by the spigot that's on the tank itself. Now the blade guides on the Woodmizer mill are ceramic rods. They're held in place in this aluminum clamp housing. There's one on the bottom, there's one on the top, and then on the back side there is also a guide block that backs up the blade so it doesn't push in. Now, I bought this mill 3 years ago, and the new current model entry-level mill from Woodmizer has a different blade guide system, but this system works just fine. It's nice and smooth, and I like it. Now, the blade guide system on the Harbor Freight mill bolts into these posts that drop down through a round hole. This is what the whole guide block system looks like. It is a couple blocks that guide the blade, and then there is a sealed roller bearing that backs up the blade. You can see the flat side on this post. When you put it in, that bolt tightens up against the flat side, so it really can only go in one way, and it's always going to be true. I'm not sure what these blocks are made out of. Maybe they're carbon of some kind. I don't know if they're graphite, what they are. They're held by two bolts that are locked into this channel on the back side. So you can tighten, loosen, and move them without an extra wrench on the back. And then there is that sealed bearing that keeps the blade from being forced backwards. Now, I bought like a 10-pack of these things because this is a wear part, and they are easy to find and they're pretty cheap. I get them on eBay. I think I paid about $16 for a 5-pack, and they're sitting there ready to go if I need them. I've never had to change these ones yet. Now, I admit I have a lot more footage for the Harbor Freight guide block system than I do the Woodmizer, but I've used this mill quite a bit more, and I think it needs a little bit of explanation of how it all goes together. Now let's take a look at the log stops. The log stop system on the Woodmizer mill is quite ingenious. The log stop slides down through this 90-degree hole cut out of the bracket that holds the log stop. And then like a gear shifter, it kind of shifts into position and you can set it at any height you want. No tools, no extra moving parts. It's quite a good system. Now this mill came with short log stops and long ones. I only use the long ones because this mill is on a trailer. But if it was on the ground, the short ones would come in handy, because you could drop them in and they wouldn't hit the ground and stop. I don't know who thought this up, but they did a good job. You check the log stops with a carpenter's square when you set the brackets to make sure that they're true. Now on the Harbor Freight sawmill, the log stops are very rudimentary. I think you probably see a pattern here. The Harbor Freight mill in and of itself is quite a bit more rudimentary. And these are just box channel iron with a couple little knobs welded on them here and there. And they drop down through another piece of box channel that's just a little bit larger. And then there's a set screw. So you can set them at any height that you want. The Harbor Freight mill comes with both long and short log stops. And to lock them into position, there is a big T-handled lock bolt. And this is housed in a 1-inch thick steel threaded insert that's welded into that box channel. Very simple, but a very strong system. Now the log clamp on the Harbor Freight mill is very similar. It's just a threaded rod sharpened to a point on one end with a handle, and it goes through a tapped insert in that post. It's adjustable every direction. You can adjust the log clamp itself, you can adjust the position of the log clamp mechanism, and you can make it longer and shorter because it is a 2-part log clamp, and you can take out the center part. You can slide it farther in, you can slide it farther out, and then lock it with that handle in the middle. The log clamp on the Woodmizer mill is similar in a lot of respects. It's not adjustable, it's all one piece, so you change the height just by the angle of the clamp itself. The threaded rod that actually clamps the log in is more robust, and it's blunt on the end that contacts the log. It also has this cap with it, so you can either use the point to bite into the log, or you can use that shelf area if you're trying to hold a cant. Now that cap doesn't attach to that log clamp in any way, so it's going to be pretty easy to lose. You're going to want to keep your eyes on it. Now this log clamp holds onto the bar just by torsion. Unlike the Harbor Freight with the set screw, this one stays in place without the need for a set screw. The track on the Woodmizer mill is good, thick, heavy steel, and it's a harder steel. I've drilled holes in this to mount it to the trailer, and it's quite a bit harder to drill. The ends are held together by these horseshoe-shaped clamps, and then the outsides are held together by these gussets. The track itself is quite tall, which makes it rigid. The track on the Harbor Freight mill is at least as thick as the Woodmizer, if not thicker. But it's pretty rudimentary again. It's just a standard chunk of angle iron. And it bolts together with just a couple little lap joints and bolts at the junction between the two sections of track. Now, one of the major differences between these two mills is the blade guard system. On the Harbor Freight mill, it's 2 doors with a hinge on each end that open from the middle, and then everything is accessible. To hold these doors closed, there's a single bolt with a little handle on it that threads in, and you're done. Well, the Harbor Freight mill has a single screw that holds the guards together. This guard is held together by 2 rubber straps, 1 on each end, 2 latches. And when you do open the head, It's held open by this mechanism, which has a bolt, a bar, a latch, another bolt, a spring, another bolt. So it locks by itself. You have to release it. Add to that it has a whole nother plate that mounts over the top for this hole, and a bracket on the top of the saw head to catch the door when you open it. The whole thing is ridiculously overcomplicated. The Harbor Freight mill opens up, it closes, it's got one bolt that holds it all together, and this blade cover literally has a whole bag full of parts and pieces to do its thing, to get it out of the way. Where the green mill, you just open the doors, you shut them, you screw in a little screw, and you're good to go. Another major difference between the two mills is the carriage feet. On the Harbor Freight mill, you have this big long section of box channel with two uprights, and it's held to the posts with these big cast iron brackets and bolts. Very basic system. Everything is robust. Everything is welded. On the other side, you can see there's a flat clamp. If you look at this wheel, it's just a steel wheel with a groove with bearings on the inside. And the entire wheel carriage is 3 feet long, which does limit the length of the cut. The nut that holds that bolt is almost 1 1/8 inches. Very simple, very heavy duty. The feet on the Woodmizer are a foot shorter than they are on the Harbor Freight, but that didn't seem to affect the stability at all. They're also much lighter construction. Thinner metal, stamped, folded, welded, lots of stamp work or water jetting. Much more complicated, lighter design. And we have a sealed bearing to run the outside of the track, and another sealed bearing that is going to run on the top of the track. 3 bearings on each corner as opposed to one big wheel. All in all, no complaints. Seems to work just fine. 2 very, very different designs that both do the same thing, and they both work good. Now let's take a look at tightening the blade. It's just a big handle on the Harbor Freight mill. And if you look over here at the Woodmizer mill, it's a threaded rod with a nut on the end. There's the thread to tighten the blade, and on the very end is the nut. This comes with a ratcheting wrench, which I've lost, to tighten up the blade. Now the tracking is exactly the same on both mills and adjusted from the same place to get the blade centered on the drive wheels. And again, even the tracking nut is heavier duty on the Harbor Freight mill. Here I want to also mention again the locking handles on the Harbor Freight mill that hold the head secure. On the Woodmizer, you only have the friction of this clutch system to hold the head in place, and it has slipped on me once. Now the main support here that holds the uprights, it's like a 2x4 box channel. It's quite robust, it's very simple. On one side it clamps onto the upright, which is a round upright, and on the other side it bolts onto the square upright. And if we look at the Woodmizer, the top of the saw head is just a light duty piece of C-channel. Very different, but it does work just fine. The band wheels on the Woodmizer are 16 inches. The band wheels on the Harbor Freight are 19 inches. The Woodmizer mill has a tensioning pulley that applies tension to the belt to make it turn. This pulley is hard mounted to the crankshaft of the engine itself, so it's always turning. But the belt doesn't have any tension, it won't grab that pulley. This cable applies tension to this pulley, pulling it up into the belt. It also runs the throttle cable, which is attached right here. When you pull in on the handle, you're tensioning that belt with that movable pulley. You're also operating the throttle cable. Compared to the Harbor Freight mill, speed of the engine is just operated by a simple throttle cable. And the belt is ran off a centrifugal clutch. Rev up the motor, the clutch grabs and turns. Now the water tank that comes standard on this mill was pretty much a piece of garbage. It took about 1 year and it completely disintegrated from being dry rotted. But the bracket that held the original tank is a perfect fit for one of these $15 Harbor Freight pump sprayers. And this is actually a bigger tank. It works perfect and it does exactly what you want to do. Now both of these sawmills cut really well. I've enjoyed using both of them. I do find that the Woodmizer tends to feel a little smoother, making the cut where the Harbor Freight can kind of shift back and forth a little bit as the wheels go down the track. That probably has more to do with how sharp the blade is than anything else. The strong point of the Harbor Freight mill is obviously the fact it is robust and it is extremely simple. The Harbor Freight mill probably has half as many components as the Woodmizer. I would say that one con to this mill, the way it comes, it's only going to cut about a 9-foot board. It has 2 6-foot sections of track. And it's got those long feet at the bottom with the rollers on each end, and those take up quite a bit of space. So it'll actually get to the end of the track and stop, and you won't have as much cut as you get with the Woodmizer mill, the way that the Woodmizer ships. Now the Woodmizer is supposed to be able to cut a 26-inch diameter log, and it's supposed to have a 10-foot 2-inch cut with the 2 sections of track it normally comes with. I bought an extra section of track, so I've never been able to check this out. I can cut, I think, a 16 with what I have. Putting the Woodmizer together was a bit frustrating. It is an overly complicated mill for what it actually does. But once it is all together and dialed in, it does a great job. I think the running theme here is quite obvious. If you want something that's very robust and very rudimentary and simple, the Harbor Freight's the way to go. The Woodmizer is lighter built and obviously over-engineered, but it does a great job too. The track on the Woodmizer is probably superior to the one on the Harbor Freight, and in my experience, the feet of the Woodmizer tend to roll on the track a little smoother than that of the Harbor Freight. On the other hand, the cable raising system on the Harbor Freight is so rock solid and isn't going to loosen up during the cutting process and change the depth of the cut. Not only that, but it has the redundant feature of these locking handles that lock the saw head in place. It is a bulletproof system to guarantee that your saw head is going to stay where you set it. On the Woodmizer mill, the only thing holding the saw head up is this clutch plate mechanism, and I've had it slip on me once already. This put a nice dip in the cut of that particular board, and I'm not sure why it did it, and it didn't do it again, just one time. I don't know why, but I'm not sure how I feel about this clutch. Now, Woodmizer is not, to my knowledge, offering this anymore. They have a completely different arrangement on their new small entry-level mills, but for this particular mill, I'm not sure how I feel about the clutch. It worked perfect the rest of the time. The Woodmizer uses a Kohler engine, and the fuel shutoff and kill switch are integrated together. That's a nice feature. Now, according to the product overview, you can cut a 20-inch log with the Harbor Freight mill, but as you can see, my brother and I have run some really big timber through this. I think this log is a 26-inch log. We had to take off the push handle in order to raise the mill high enough to clear the log. One of the things about this mill that can be worked around in the event that you need to. But when you do get into big logs like this, you have to have some way to move them around. So you're kind of more limited by the machinery that you have to move the logs around than the mill itself, because it'll cut a pretty good sized log. Now, Woodmizer is owned by its employees, and it's an American company out of Indianapolis. The Harbor Freight mill, of course, is completely made in China, probably by people that make 100 other different things and aren't a sawmill specific company. That's one of the biggest reasons why you'd want to buy a Woodmizer. If you needed a bearing, if you needed a part, if you needed a piece, you can pick up the phone, you can call them, and you can get anything you want. On the other hand, the Harbor Freight mill has probably half as many parts. They're twice as heavy duty. If you need new bearings, you're just going to have to buy those by the part number that's on the bearing. They're, of course, made in China, but the bearings on the Woodmizer mill are also made in China. So if you're in the market for an entry-level sawmill, and the Harbor Freight and the Woodmizer are both on your radar, I hope this video has answered some questions and given you a very detailed, in-depth look at how these two machines are made, what my impression as an owner of both of them has been, and ultimately what might be the better choice for you. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name's Dave Whipple, and you've been watching Bush Radical. And be radical, hey? See you soon.